The smell of burnt copper filled the room when the oxygen line snapped and whipped across my face, slicing my cheek open. I didn't wipe the blood away. I couldn't move. I was looking down into Thomas Harrison's open chest, and I realized he was looking back. Not with his eyes, those were taped shut, but through the monitor. His heart rate was a flat, screaming line of pure agony. I had made a mistake with the dosage. He was wide awake, paralyzed, and feeling every inch of the scalpel. But I couldn't stop the surgery. If I did, the chief of surgery would realize I'd just tortured his brother-in-law. I had exactly 4 minutes before the sedative wore off completely, and Thomas's brain would short-circuit from the pain. But as I reached for the dial to fix it, I saw the lead surgeon's hand shake. She wasn't trying to save him. She was waiting for him to die, and she was looking at me like I was the one holding the knife. Let me take you back to where this began. The rhythmic chirp of the heart monitor pulsed against the hum of the air filtration system, a steady, metronomic heartbeat of the room itself. David Miller leaned toward the glowing display, squinting at the green jagged lines that danced across the black glass. Thomas Harrison lay beneath the blue surgical drapes, a landscape of pale skin and iodine stains that smelled of sharp chemicals and old copper. The patient's pupils, uncovered for a fleeting check, were blown wide, darting beneath translucent lids as if chasing a nightmare he couldn't escape. A bead of sweat rolled from Harrison's hairline into the padding of the headrest, soaking into the foam with a dull, damp weight. David's fingers hovered over the vaporizer dial, the cold plastic biting into his skin. The digital readout for the paralytic agent sat at a steady infusion rate, but the anesthetic gas levels dipped into the red. He checked the intravenous line, his pulse hammering in his fingertips. A hairline fracture in the plastic connector sent a steady drip of clear fluid weeping onto the linoleum floor. Plink, 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 instead of into the man's vein. Harrison's heart rate spiked. 110, 120. The surgeon, Dr. Sarah Johnson, grunted, her scalpel poised over the exposed fascia of the abdomen. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the scent of scorched dust and the metallic tang of blood. "He's awake," David whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Sarah didn't lift her head, her white lab coat gleaming with an aggressive, bleached intensity. "Keep him under, Miller. He's twitching." "He is not twitching. He is screaming." David gripped the manual ventilation bag, the rubbery texture slick against his palms. The resistance told him everything. Harrison's diaphragm strained against the mechanical rhythm, a silent, suffocating struggle. The dosage error glared from the chart, a misplaced decimal point in the pre-op orders that David had verified 3 times, or thought he had. David reached for the emergency bolus, his palms slick inside latex gloves. Every second of silence cost Harrison a lifetime of trauma. The smell of cauterized flesh filled the small gap between David's mask and his face, thick and cloying. He pushed the medication, watching the monitor, praying for the jagged lines to settle before the first incision went deeper. He could feel the weight of his father's legacy, the military precision, the 47 identical white shirts in his closet, all of it pressing down on him. A single mistake was a death sentence. Subverted, David stared at the dials, his mind racing through the logic of the situation. To report the error now would mean an immediate halt to the surgery. It would trigger a formal investigation. It would mean the end of his bid for chief of anesthesiology. But more importantly, it would mean admitting he was fallible. He decided to handle it internally. He would adjust the dials, bypass the faulty connector, and flood Harrison's system with a concentrated burst of sedative. It was the smart move, the move of a man who knew his equipment better than anyone else. He would fix the mistake before anyone even knew it happened. This was the only way to ensure the patient's safety while preserving the integrity of the surgical team. He reached out and began to twist the dials with surgical precision. He felt a wave of relief as the heart rate monitor began to slow. 100, 95, 90. It was working. He had caught the tailspin and leveled the plane. He looked over at Sarah, who remained buried in the patient's abdomen, oblivious. He had saved the day, saved his career, and saved Thomas Harrison from the horror of the knife. He let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders dropping from their rigid, military posture. The crisis was over. He was still the smartest man in the room. He reached for the chart to update the logs, his hand steady. But then, he noticed something. Sarah wasn't just working. She was watching him out of the corner of her eye. Her posture was too stiff, her movements too deliberate. He looked down at the anesthesia workstation. A small blue light was blinking on the side of the machine. A light he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a standard indicator. It was a data link light, showing that the machine was currently being monitored and recorded by the hospital's main administrative hub. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach, making his knees weak. By manually overriding the dials without logging the error, he hadn't just fixed a mistake. He had created a digital trail of unauthorized tampering. He had bypassed the safety protocols in a way that looked like intentional malpractice. He looked up at the observation gallery and saw the silhouette of Michael Davis, the hospital's legal counsel, leaning against the glass. Michael wasn't just watching. He was holding a tablet, his thumb moving rhythmically. David realized the trap. The faulty connector hadn't been an accident. The decimal point error hadn't been a slip of the pen. They had known he would try to hide it. They had relied on his ego, his need to be perfect, to lure him into a fix that was actually a confession. He was no longer just a doctor who made a mistake. He was a doctor who had covered up a life-threatening error in real time. He had handed them the very rope they would use to hang him. The world tilted, the sterile white walls of the OR suddenly feeling like the bars of a cage. The tension in the room snapped when a sharp hiss erupted from the anesthesia rig. A pressurized oxygen line, weakened by a hairline fracture David hadn't seen, suddenly gave way. The hose whipped through the air like a panicked cobra, the sound of violent, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack against the stainless steel cabinets. "Get back!" David shouted, lunging for the thrashing line. The heavy rubber hose struck him across the face, the brass fitting biting into his cheek. He felt the warm, metallic taste of blood fill his mouth instantly. The room blurred as the oxygen hissed into the sterile field, threatening to turn a spark into an inferno. David wrestled with the hose, his fingers fumbling against the high-pressure spray that smelled of ozone and cold metal. He threw his weight onto the line, pinning it against the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. With a final, desperate twist, he slammed the emergency shutoff valve. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic chirping of the alarms. David sat on the floor, blood dripping onto his green scrubs, his chest heaving. He had stopped the explosion, but as he looked at the monitors, he saw the ultimate price of the chaos. Thomas Harrison's blood pressure was climbing again, and the sedative levels were flatlining. He stood up, his legs shaking, and reached for the patient's chart to check the emergency contact info. Anything to distract from the throbbing in his face. His eyes scanned the personal history section, and his heart stopped. Next of kin, Jennifer Martinez. Jennifer Martinez was the chief of surgery. Thomas Harrison wasn't just a patient. He was the man married to the woman who held David's entire future in her hands. The mistake wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was a professional execution. Sarah Johnson didn't look up from the open cavity. Her voice was cold, clinical. "We are moving to the tumor extraction, Miller. If you cannot keep him stable, I will have you removed from this theater. The chief is watching from the gallery. Do not embarrass us further." David looked up. Through the glass of the observation gallery, he saw the silver-streaked hair of Jennifer Martinez. She was standing perfectly still, her arms crossed, her face a mask of detached professionalism. But then he heard it. A low, vibrating sound coming through the intercom system. She was humming. A low, haunting funeral dirge that vibrated in David's very teeth. It was the sound of a disaster already in progress. David turned back to the dials, his mind a whirlwind of panic and precision. He had to fix this. He had to be the smartest man in the room. He began to increase the anesthetic gas, his fingers moving in a practiced, rhythmic sequence. But the machine refused to respond. It hissed, a low, mocking sound that vibrated through the floor. A limit-exceeded alarm began to wail, a high-pitched scream that filled the small room. "Miller, silence that," Sarah snapped, her scalpel moving with a predatory grace. "The system is not accepting the input," David said, his voice rising. Suddenly, the surgical lights flickered. Once, twice. A rhythmic signal that made the shadows dance across Thomas Harrison's pale skin. A heavy tray of stainless steel instruments, sitting on a perfectly level table, began to slide. It moved slowly at first, then gathered speed, crashing to the floor with a deafening clang that echoed like a gunshot. "What is happening in here?" a voice demanded. It was Leo, the young intern. He was staring at the anesthesia readout with wide, terrified eyes. "Dr. Miller, the levels, they are all wrong. He's going to wake up. Let me help." Leo lunged for the workstation, his hands reaching for the dials David had just adjusted. "Get away from there," David shouted. He stepped into Leo's path, his rigid posture becoming a physical barrier. They were in a narrow corner of the OR, the air smelling of sweat and floor wax. David pushed Leo back, his hands gripping the younger man's shoulders. "I have it under control. Go back to the field." "You don't," Leo yelled, his voice cracking. "You're killing him." David felt a surge of cold fury. He shoved Leo harder, pinning him against the cold tiled wall. "I am the senior anesthesiologist. You will follow my lead, or you will never see the inside of an OR again. Do you understand me?" Leo stared at him, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He looked at the floor, his eyes darting toward the ceiling tiles as he began to count under his breath. 41. 42. He was retreating into himself, the way he always did when the world became too loud. A sharp knock at the OR door broke the tension. A nurse entered, holding a thick envelope. "Doctor?" "Miller? This was just delivered by a process server. They said it was urgent." David took the envelope with a trembling hand. He tore it open, the paper sharp against his skin. It wasn't a divorce. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a federal summons, an investigation into a pharmaceutical kickback scheme involving the hospital's administration. His eyes scanned the names listed in the document. Sarah Johnson, Michael Davis, Jennifer Martinez. And then he saw the date of the alleged incident, that had triggered the investigation. It was the same day he had been promoted to senior staff. He looked at Sarah. She was making an incision, but it was wrong. It was too deep, too wide. She was intentionally complicating the surgery, creating a crisis that would require more medication, more time, more errors. "You're doing it on purpose," David whispered. Sarah finally looked at him. Her gaze was predatory, unblinking. "The patient is unstable, David. Your erratic behavior is putting this entire hospital at risk. I'm afraid I'll have to report your incompetence to the board. Feds were looking at a malpractice event. He was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event, he was the distraction. As long as the feds were looking at a malpractice event involving a rogue anesthesiologist, they wouldn't be looking at the millions of dollars disappearing into offshore accounts. Thomas Harrison's blood pressure spiked to 200. The monitor's wail became a continuous, piercing shriek. "He's having a stroke," Karen Mitchell cried, her voice full of the desperation of a woman who had already lost too much. She pulled a crumpled napkin from her pocket, her fixer instincts kicking in. "I have the protocol right here, David. We need to push the beta blockers." David ignored her. He saw Michael Davis in the gallery, cracking his knuckles, pop, pop, pop. A rhythmic countdown to the end of David's life. "I have a vial," David muttered to himself. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold glass cylinder of a fast-acting sedative he had kept from a previous shift. A lucky backup he never thought he'd need. He moved toward the IV port, his heart hammering against his ribs. This would stop the stroke. This would save Thomas. This would prove he was still a doctor. As he reached for the line, Sarah Johnson's hand blurred. She slipped with the scalpel, the blade flashing in the harsh LED lights. The cold steel slashed across David's hand. He felt the bite before he felt the pain. The sedative vial slipped from his fingers and shattered on the linoleum, the clear liquid mixing with the blood now pouring from his palm. "Oh, David," Sarah said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You're bleeding. You've contaminated the field. Step away from the patient immediately." David stared at his hand. The blood was bright, aggressive against the white tile. He looked at the anesthesia machine, his mind stripping away the casing, seeing the logic of the wires. He lunged for the back panel, ripping it open. There it was, a small black box spliced into the internal wiring. A physical bypass. It wasn't a software glitch. It was a mechanical sabotage designed to override his inputs and ensure the machine failed at the most critical moment. "Dr. Miller." Michael Davis's voice boomed over the intercom, cold and final. "Security is on their way. You are being removed from this facility. Please step away from the table." David looked at Thomas Harrison. The man's eyes were open now, staring at the ceiling with a raw, primal terror. He was awake. He was paralyzed. And he was dying. "No," David said. He turned and sprinted for the OR doors, slamming the heavy steel bolts into place. The sound of the locks engaging echoed like a prison door closing. "What are you doing?" Sarah shrieked. "I am saving my patient," David said. The lights went black. The administration had cut the power. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, David felt the world shrink to the size of the operating table. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the backup batteries failing. He couldn't see, but he could smell. The bleach, the blood, the scorched dust. He reached out, his hands finding the manual bellows. He began to pump, the rubber resisting his touch, a rhythmic whoosh thump that kept Thomas's lungs moving. He reached for a syringe, feeling the weight of it, the texture of the plunger. He found the central line by touch alone, the cold plastic guiding his fingers. "I've got you," David whispered into the dark. "I've got you." He pushed the medicine, a blind injection born of 20 years of precision. He felt the tension in Thomas's body begin to ease. The frantic tapping of the man's fingers against the drape slowed, then stopped. "Miller, open this door," a voice shouted from the hallway. The sound of fists pounding against the steel was like 1,000 hammers. David didn't move. He stayed by the table, his hand on Thomas's shoulder, feeling the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of the man's chest. He reached down and touched his smartwatch, the small screen glowing with a faint, ghostly light. He began to record. "Why did you do it, Sarah?" he asked, his voice calm in the darkness. "Because you were easy, David." Her voice came from the shadows, sharp and bitter. "You and your shirts, you and your numbers. You were so busy being perfect that you never noticed we were using you to build a wall around ourselves. Thomas had to die. He was getting too close. And you were the perfect weapon to kill him with." David felt a cold shiver go down his spine. He had it. The confession. The doors burst open. Flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding and intrusive. Security guards tackled David to the floor, the cold linoleum biting into his knees. "Get him out of here," Michael Davis shouted, his charcoal suit looking like a shadow in the flickering emergency lights. Subverted. 3 months later, the air in the medical board's hearing room was stale, smelling of old paper and bitter coffee. David sat at the mahogany table, his spine as rigid as a structural beam. He had the recording. He had the evidence of the bypass device. He had the federal summons. He looked at the panel of doctors, men and women who had once been his peers, and felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace for Thomas Harrison. I was distracted by for Thomas Harrison. I was distracted by my own ego, my own need to appear untouchable. I am here to surrender my medical license. He saw the shock on their faces. He saw Sarah Johnson sitting in the back row, her predatory gaze faltering for the first time. He continued, laying out the evidence of the hospital's corruption, the kickback scheme, and the intentional sabotage of the anesthesia machine. He was doing the right thing. He was clearing his conscience. He was sacrificing his career to ensure that the people who had turned a house of healing into a den of thieves would finally face justice. He felt a weight lift off his shoulders, a sense of moral redemption that he hadn't felt in years. He had lost his uniform, but he had found the man inside. The board chairman, a man with a face like crumpled parchment, looked down at the documents David had provided. He looked at the recording. Then he looked at David. "Dr. Miller," the chairman said, his voice devoid of emotion. "By your own admission, you committed a critical medical error and then engaged in a series of highly irregular, illegal actions within a sterile operating environment. You barricaded a room, ignored direct orders from administration, and performed unsanctioned procedures in the dark." David frowned. "To save the patient's life, to stop the sabotage. The hospital administration has provided documentation," the chairman continued, "showing that the bypass device you found was actually a standard diagnostic tool installed for a routine maintenance check, a check you were notified of via email 3 weeks prior. An email you, by your own admission, did not read because you were focused on your rotation." David felt the floor drop away. That's a lie," Sarah confessed. "I have the recording." "The recording," the chairman said, "is of a woman speaking in a high-stress, darkened environment while being intimidated by a man who had just barricaded her in a room. Our legal counsel informs us it is inadmissible as evidence of a conspiracy, but it is quite effective as evidence of your deteriorating mental state." David looked at Sarah. She was smiling now, that warm, motherly smile she used on donors. She wasn't being investigated. She was being protected. The hospital had used his confession of the initial error to invalidate everything else he said. By being honest, he had given them the ultimate weapon. He wasn't a whistleblower. He was a disgraced, mentally unstable doctor who had nearly killed a patient and then hallucinated a conspiracy to cover his tracks. "The board hereby revokes your license to practice medicine in the state of New York, effective immediately," the chairman said. "We will also be forwarding our findings to the district attorney for potential criminal charges regarding the endangerment of Thomas Harrison." David sat down, the mahogany table feeling cold and alien. He had tried to be the hero. He had tried to be honest. And the system had swallowed him whole. A week later, David sat on a bench in a quiet park. The grass was too green, the bird song sounding like a looped recording in the heavy, 95-degree heat. He wore a simple t-shirt. No starch, no collar, no rotation number. A man approached the bench. He walked with a slight limp, his rugged, weathered face etched with the lines of a man who had seen too much. He sat down next to David, his eyes scanning the park with a practiced, hyper-vigilant intensity. "Nice day?" the man said. David didn't look up. "I suppose." "I heard about the hearing," the man said. "I'm sorry." David finally looked at him. It was Thomas Harrison. He looked different in the daylight, not a patient, not a victim. He looked like a hunter. You were awake, David said. The whole time, Thomas replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver badge. I'm with the FBI, David. I've been undercover at St. Jude's for 18 months. David stared at the badge. Then you know. You know I was telling the truth. I know, Thomas said. And because of what you did in that dark room, we have enough to move on the RICO charges. Sarah, Michael, Jennifer, they're all going down. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. It won't give me my life back, David said. Thomas looked at him, a silent, haunting nod of recognition passing between them. Two men broken by the same knife, standing on opposite sides of a war they hadn't asked for. No, Thomas said. But you kept your soul, Doc, in that building? That's a miracle. Thomas stood up and walked away, his limp a rhythmic reminder of the price of the truth. David stayed on the bench, the sun hot on his skin, watching the swings move in the windless air. He was a broken man. He was an honest man. And for the first time in 42 years, he didn't care if his shirt was wrinkled.